So we're going to start now from the Gemara with the words my area. So my area arvei Pesachim, afilu arvei Shabbatot v'yamim tovim nami. The Gemara asked the question on the Mishnah that said, why does the Mishnah specifically choose the words arvei Pesachim? Why didn't it say arvei Shabbatot v'yamim tovim nami? Now, why does the Gemara ask this? So they continue to tell you. Ditanyas, it says in a Braita, Lo yochal adam b'arvei Shabbatot v'yamim tovim min hamincha ulamala kedei sheikanes l'Shabbat kashu ta'ava. So what does this mean? The Braita says a person shouldn't eat. So the Braita here is brought, they're bringing in an outside source, a Braita, from the time of the Mishnah, to say that in that same time period that the Mishnah was written, there was another source that said, not just about Pesach, but it's the same for every Erev Shabbat, Erev Chag, from Mincha Ulamala. What's the reason? Kedei sheikanes l'Shabbat kashu ta'ava, so that you go into Shabbat being hungry. So now they say, that's Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Yossi Omer. So this is a classic Braita where it first tells you the first line is somebody speaking. The second line is somebody else speaking. So you know we're still in the Braita. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ochel v'holech ad shetechshach. There's two opinions. One is Rabbi Yehuda who says you can't eat from Mincha and on. And the second opinion is Rabbi Yossi, who says on every Erev Shabbat and Erev Chag, you can eat as long as you want until nighttime. No problem whatsoever. So what's the Gemara's question? The Gemara is a very interesting question. The Gemara says, if this Mishnah says on Erev Pesach, you can't eat from Samuch LeMincha, near Mincha time, which we said was half an hour before Mincha, that's basically the same thing as on Erev Shabbat. So why did the Mishnah only point out Erev Shabbat, Erev Pesach, when it should have pointed out Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov? Now, my immediate reaction to this Gemara, and maybe you thought the same thing, is what a weird question, because Erev Pesach makes perfect sense that they're discussing this in our chapter. But to start talking about Shabbat and Yom Tov, it has nothing to do with our Masechet. Our Masechet is Pesachim. We've been talking about Pesachim. Why on earth are they asking, why would Shabbat and Yom Tov be included also? So, and in fact, you would expect the Gemara to answer, the very easy answer that if I asked you this in class, you would say, it's because this has nothing to do with Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov. Our topic is Pesach. If you want to know about Erev Shabbat, go to Masechet Shabbat. If you want to know about Erev Yom Tov, go to Masechet Beitza, where there's all sorts of issues about Yom Tov in general. But this doesn't belong here. But the Gemara doesn't answer that, and I'll come back to my question in a few minutes. But the Gemara brings two different answers. So we're going to have Rav Huna and Rav Papa. I hope that you noticed that when you were going through that it says Amar Rav Huna, and then it says Amar and Rav Papa Amar. Okay, so each of them is a different Amora giving an answer. Now, if you notice, there was a machloket in this. Machloket is an argument. There was an argument in this Braita about Rabbi Yehuda, who says Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov from Mincha, and Rabbi Yossi, who said, no, there's no problem whatsoever. So Rav Huna has a very easy answer, and he says, don't ask me a question from this Braita on our Mishnah, because your whole question was premised on Rabbi Yehuda's approach. But comes Rav Huna and he says, Lo tzricha ela Rabbi Yossi. Our Mishnah was talking according to Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Now, if you're holding by Rabbi Yossi, who says that there's no problem of eating on Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov, then you're obviously going to assume that we have to say this only about Pesach. There'd be no question whatsoever. So that's a very easy answer. He says, our Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yossi, our Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yehuda, who said that there's a problem. So therefore, there's no reason to mention Shabbat and Yom Tov because it's just not true. According to Rabbi Yossi, there's no issue there. There's no prohibition. But Rav Papa doesn't like this answer. Now, what motivates Rav Papa, right? So Rav Huna says, let's Rabbi Yossi. Let's just read on a little more in Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, so therefore, he says, when Rabbi Yossi says it. Now, one thing you could think is that if Rabbi Yossi holds on Erev Shabbat and Erev Chag, you can eat as long as you want, then maybe he would say the same thing for Pesach, and maybe the Mishnah doesn't go by him at all. But he comes Rav Huna and he says, no, according to Rabbi Yossi, that's exactly the point. Erev Shabbat is very different than Erev Pesach. And I asked you to think about why there would be differences between Erev Shabbat and Pesach. And based on last week's class, you can come and tell me, well, Erev Pesach has the sacrifice. So that's something very different. That's number one. Number two, we could say that Erev Pesach has more preparations than an average holiday. So maybe for that reason, don't start getting yourself busy with eating, right? Whereas Shabbat, that would be something different. But Amar Rav Huna, so then Rav Huna says, so Hanemile, that whole thing that Rabbi Yossi says, that again, Hanemile means these words are true only for Arvei Shabbatot v'Yamim Tovim. Aval be'erev haPesach, and here comes his reason, not because of the Korban, but he says, Mishum chiyuva de matzah modeh. Comes Rabbi Yossi, according to Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, I'm going to guess. He doesn't know what Rabbi Yossi holds, really, because Rabbi Yossi isn't alive anymore. So he says, I'm going to assume that Rabbi Yossi would hold that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi. That's why it doesn't mention Shabbat and Yom Tov, not because our topic is Pesach, but because it really should have. If it was Rabbi Yehuda who held that across the board there's always this issue, then yes. But if you're not Rabbi Yehuda and you're Rabbi Yossi, you would still agree that because of matzah, because we don't want you to eat too much matzah, therefore you would assume that there's an issue here, right? That you would assume that's why on Erev Pesach, it's true, you can't eat from Mincha, but on any Erev Chag, you can. But Aval Erev Pesach, so because of Chiyuv de Matzah Modeh, what does Modeh mean? He agrees with Rabbi Yehuda that specifically on Erev Pesach, this would be the case. Comes Rav Papa, and Rav Papa says, wait a minute. Rav Papa says, Afilu Tema Rabbi Yehuda. I can even explain this according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now, what's Rav Papa's motivation? Rav Papa's motivation is we much rather, and this is something methodological that's important to know, it's not great to say that a Mishnah only goes by one opinion. You much rather have a Mishnah be all-encompassing and fit in with all the other opinions. And that's where Rav Papa is going to try to come up with a creative solution as to why we can explain the Mishnah also according to Rabbi Yehuda. So he's going to be very specific. He says like this, Afilu Tema Rabbi Yehuda. I can even explain our Mishnah according to Rabbi Yehuda. How so? Hatam says there, Ba'arvei Shabbatot v'Yamim Tovim, he says you didn't pay attention when you asked the question. There it says, Min amincha u'lamala hu da'asur. And in our Mishnah, what does it say? Right? It says, Samuch lemincha. So he says, there, Hatam. Hatam is there. How do I know Hatam is there? I'll give you some tricks. These are pointers to learning Aramaic. Taf and Shin switch. Okay, I'll give you some examples. The word tlat, like in Hebrew, if you know Hebrew, there's something called a tlat ofan. That's a tricycle because it has 3 wheels. Tlat is shalosh because Taf and Shin switch. So shalosh, so here you have Hatam is sham. Okay, forget about the hey, but tam is sham. There. Now there usually means a source that we brought from the outside. There, ba'arvei Shabbatot v'Yamim Tovim. It's min amincha, meaning, remember we talked about this last week? Our Mishnah said samuch. What did we say samuch was? A half an hour before. But he says the source about Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov say min amincha. That means at mincha, not a half an hour before. So they infer, and then we're going to say very easily, it doesn't say so in our Mishnah about Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov because it's not the same time. It's a difference of half an hour. You might say half an hour is not a huge amount of time, but it happens to be, it's a different amount of time. So he says, there, Barvei Shabbatot v'Yamim Tovim min amincha u'lamala hu da'asir. It's forbidden specifically min amincha u'lamala from the time of mincha, which again, we said last week, there was a debate, mincha ktana, mincha gedola, but we're going with the opinion that it's mincha ktana, which means 9.5 hours into the day. So on Shabbat and Yom Tov, it's from 9.5 hours into the day. Samuch lemincha shari, but near mincha time, it will be permitted. Aval be'erev haPesach, hafilu samuch lemincha nami asur. But when it comes to Erev Pesach, there it's going to be a half hour earlier. Okay, so now we're going to stop here. I'm going to go in depth into one more thing, and then we're going to move to Chavruta. So Tosfot has a very interesting, Tosfot asks exactly my question. Okay, Tosfot says exactly what I was struggling with. Tosfot says, "My iri arvei psachim," and Tosfot basically says, I'm not going to read this inside, but I'm going to paraphrase it because the goal of our class is not necessarily to read a Tosfot, but it's just really to learn how to read the Gemara. The Tosfots are like the icing on the cake if you get through it. Tosfot basically says, I'll give you 2 reasons why the Gemara didn't simply say, because our topic is Erev Pesach. Okay, Tosfot says our topic is Pesach. So why on earth would you be asking about Shabbat? And he gives 2 interesting answers. One is because Shabbat is so common, it comes every week, that because of that, you would think that it would be inappropriate not to mention Shabbat. Okay? Very interesting answer. It reminds me, for those who are learning the daf, we just started today, the 5th chapter, which talks about Tamid Shenishchat. And it talks about when you do the Korban Pesach, at what hour of the day. And it starts off the chapter, by the way, also people learning the daf in the 4th chapter, they asked the exact same question. There they said there was a minhag not to work on Erev Pesach. And then it started questioning, what's the difference between this and Erev Shabbat? Isn't it? It also, there's an issue on Erev Shabbat of working in the afternoon. So anyway, there's a lot of similarities here. And there, when it starts to discuss the Korban Pesach, the first thing they discuss, instead of when we do the Korban Pesach, they say first when we do the Korban Tamid, which is the one you did every day. It's almost like, yes, this is a very special day and it's very important, but you can't lose sight of the important, the daily stuff and the weekly stuff. And therefore, it would be inappropriate not to mention Shabbat. Keep this in mind because we're going to come back to this soon. The second answer he gives is that you might, if we left out Erev Shabbat, you might have thought that Erev Shabbat, and as if we should have included, if you would have said, oh, well, we're just talking about Pesach. He says, well, you might have thought then that if we're just talking about Pesach and we don't mention Shabbat, maybe people would have misunderstood and thought that Shabbat would be, you'd be allowed to do work on Shabbat. You'd be allowed to eat on Erev Shabbat. And to make sure that you don't think that, basically he comes and he says, just so that you don't think that, that's why they didn't answer that question. Because that question would have begged, that answer would have begged another question. Would have said, okay, I understand your topic is Pesach, but it would have led people to be misled into thinking that there's no such issue on Shabbat. And therefore, they asked the question, they had to come up with a different answer. Okay, so again, just to review our structure, we had a question, why did it not mention Shabbat? We kind of asked a side question, which is, why would you have thought it would have mentioned Erev Shabbat? And why you would have thought it would mention the holidays? And then we ended with two answers the Gemara gave, other than, the aside of the Tosfot, which is either it's only according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, who holds there's no prohibition on Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov, or we have the second answer, which is there's a difference of half an hour. Now that answer of there's a difference of half an hour, where Rav Papa is kind of the better approach because he can work it out with all the opinions, say both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi fit in with our Mishnah, which is great, but that's going to lead us to another problem, which is going to lead you into the second chavruta. Okay, again, I'll just tell you the structure of this chavruta. There's questions on the Gemara itself, and then there's a few questions also I wanted you to kind of figure out how to punctuate and how to separate it into sections. And then there's two in-depth questions, which because of time, I think you might want to skip those questions, although you can decide that you prefer to go more in-depth into the Rishonim, or you can move straight into the Gemara questions, which are a little bit after those two thought questions that are listed as advanced questions. You can skip those two and move into the questions on the Gemara, and then we'll come back in a few minutes and regroup. So I'll give you 10 minutes of chavruta, and then we'll do a quick sum up at the end because we're running short on time. Okay.